Next Wednesday's film at 7:25, again adapted from a classic children's adventure story, is Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island.
Next Monday, a new series of Triangle sets sail with a problem passenger.
If there's anything I can do to help you, just let me know. And if I'm not in, leave a message with Morty. He always knows where to find me.
And tensions come to a head.
I'll buy the cottage from you. Pay any price.
Any price? From you, Marion? I'd rather give it away.
A new ship and changes at the top for the Triangle line, starting next Monday at 6:55 on BBC1.
Butterflies is starting shortly on BBC2. This is BBC1. The time is 9 o'clock. There now follows a party political broadcast by the Conservative Party.
Good evening. You're probably expecting this broadcast to be about the crisis in the Falklands. But this is a subject about which the major political parties are united, and it would be wrong to make a party political broadcast about it. Nor should I talk about the Falklands when the diplomatic situation is so delicately balanced. Nor need I speak about the courage of our armed forces and the determination of our government ministers. No one doubts the determination of this government, but some people question its concern for people. So that's what we'd like to talk about tonight. For instance, how many of these criticisms have you heard before? And is there any truth in them?
The government doesn't care about the sick.
Is that so? Well, since the Conservatives came into power, hospital waiting lists have been shortened by over 120,000. Real spending on hospitals has gone up. Over £1 billion has been set aside for 123 major hospital projects. There are 34,000 more nurses and midwives, and an increase of 2,000 doctors and dentists working in the National Health Service. The truth is, this government is caring for our sick.
Maybe that's true, but surely they're cutting back on schooling.
Really? Since the government came into power, the average size of classes has got smaller. There are now 10,000 more places in nursery schools. And the government has given you the choice to nominate which school you want your child to attend, even if it is outside the local area, a right which must be honoured by the local authority whenever possible. So the truth is, this government has improved the schooling our children get.
Perhaps so, but they are making it hard to own your own home.
Well, let's take a look. Council and new town tenants have been given the right to buy or part buy their own homes. 250,000 tenants have already done so, and another 500,000 have applied. Young people who are willing to renovate their own homes are being enabled by many local authorities to buy run-down property without any interest charges to pay for the first 5 years, giving them the chance to spend that money on their homes instead. So the fact is that under this government, more people own their homes than ever before. But there is still another accusation, one that is heard more than most.
This government doesn't care about the unemployed.
Before we can talk about whether this is true or not, we need to look at the causes of unemployment. In the 70s, we paid ourselves far too much. We actually gave ourselves wage increases 20 times as big as the increase in production to pay for them. No wonder one man's wage increase became another man on the dole. But under this government, wage increases were brought down to a more reasonable level. And with that, the rise in unemployment slowed down. Now take a look at these 6 major world economies. At the end of the 70s, we were the poorest in producing wealth. Since then, the government has been getting overmanning down and productivity up, with this effect. Last year, we increased our competitiveness more than West Germany, the USA, Canada, or France. And that's another reason why the rise in unemployment is slowing down. Now here's another surprising fact. Even though there are so many people unemployed, Britain has 250,000 jobs vacant. Now many of these jobs are empty because we haven't got the people with the right skills to fill them, which the government is putting right, with billions being spent on new training programs. By the end of next year, we shall have the most advanced set of training and employment schemes anywhere in Europe. The government does care about the unemployed.
If you look at the facts, the truth is that this government does care about people. However, caring about people is much more than a state of mind. It means being willing to face up to problems and to tackle them. And more often than not, action will require courage if it is to be truly effective. It is this government's determination that is winning Britain the respect and support of countries around the world. And it is this same determination that makes caring for people possible, not just in words, but where it matters, in actions.
That was a party political broadcast by the Conservative Party. In half an hour on BBC1, we come to the last of 3 programmes considering rough justice in the case of John Walters, currently in Broadmoor, who was accused of assaulting a young girl, which he vehemently denies. The time now is 9:05.
Contact in the South Atlantic. A Sea Harrier scrambles to chase off an Argentine spy plane. Mr. Pym has a peace plan, but says there could be fighting even while the talks go on. The Argentine says it again, we won't budge on sovereignty. Conflict in the Middle East. Israel bombs Palestinian bases in Lebanon. And uses troops to clear the settlers from Yamit. Good evening. Britain's task force steaming towards the Falkland Islands has made its first contact with the Argentine military. Earlier today, an Argentine Air Force Boeing 707 flew directly towards the British flagship, the aircraft carrier Hermes, and circled her at high altitude just 12 miles away. She was chased off by a Royal Navy Sea Harrier. So the Argentines know the precise location of the British fleet. They also know the location of HMS Superb, the nuclear-powered submarine. Despite much speculation, she's not in Falklands waters. Instead, she's at her base in Scotland. That's been confirmed by the Ministry of Defence, who've also disclosed that there is an Argentine Navy vessel within Falkland waters, and it's been there since Britain introduced the maritime exclusion zone. In the midst of all this, the Foreign Secretary, Mr. Pym, was talking to MPs at Westminster and creating the impression that the task force could go into action even while he's in Washington talking about a diplomatic settlement. First, the sighting of the task force. Brian Hanrahan is on HMS Hermes and saw her encounter with the Argentine Air Force.
The aircraft, unidentified at that stage, was detected about 11:30 this morning. One of the Harriers from Hermes was scrambled to intercept and reported that the plane was an Argentine Boeing 707 in military colors, all white with blue and white roundels and flags. The Argentine Air Force has one military Boeing used for troop carrying and reconnaissance. It's their longest range aircraft and is thought to be unarmed. Although the Harrier had live missiles, the pilot who intercepted was under orders not to fire except in self-defense. With the Hermes Harrier in close company, the Boeing flew round the fleet at high altitude. It came within 12 miles before heading back to Argentina. The Argentine plane came straight towards the fleet on a steady bearing, an unlikely coincidence in the vast Southern Ocean unless it already knew where we were.
The task force had expected to be spotted by the Argentines sooner or later, but interceptions so early and at such long range cannot have been coincidental. The Argentine Air Force must have known where to look, and they were probably told by the Russians. The Boeing turned up when the carrier force was about 500 miles south of Ascension Island. Now that they've been spotted, they'll be moving up to high speed. That means they'll be coming within range of a possible Argentine attack no later than Friday, and it also means the Falklands themselves, and particularly the airstrip at Port Stanley, will in turn be within carrier airstrike range this weekend. Once these forces do close, the chances of a dogfight will increase, because the Sea Harriers will have to identify every approaching aircraft, and warplanes will have to be treated as hostile. So there's now not much time left for the diplomats before the military forces are in direct confrontation. The next British move is likely to be the declaration of an air blockade in the airspace surrounding the Falklands. That's as much for the self-protection of the task force as it is for isolating the Argentines from any further reinforcement. Today, the Defence Ministry confirmed that an Argentine auxiliary naval vessel is in Port Stanley Harbour and has been there since before the naval blockade began. She's believed to be a fleet transport like this one. They say she hasn't breached the blockade, although she is being treated as hostile and could be attacked. That may be a heavy hint to the Argentines to move these ships out of the combat zone and do it quickly. Meanwhile, British combat capabilities are being boosted. Today it was revealed the RAF ground attack version of the Harrier jump jet is to be fitted with the latest version of the Sidewinder heat-seeking air-to-air missile. The Sidewinder was the top-scoring dogfight weapon during the Vietnam War, and it already equips the Navy version of the jump jet, the Sea Harrier. It works by detecting the infrared image of a jet, and modern versions can be fired from any angle, including head-on. And the Stingray lightweight torpedo is being fitted to aircraft and ships in the task force. The Stingray is so new it hasn't even completed acceptance trials, but a batch of these sophisticated weapons, which are parachuted into the sea near hostile submarines, is being rushed out to the task force. Once underwater, the Stingray uses its own computer and sonar to detect and attack the submarine. It can even work out the best angle for attack and make several runs at the target. And the reinforcements of men are also pressing on. Today, helicopters were ferrying equipment to the roll-on, roll-off ship Norland at Hull before she sailed for Portsmouth. Tomorrow, she'll embark a battalion of paratroops and set sail for the South Atlantic. There was one minor mystery today when the Defence Ministry confirmed that the nuclear-powered fleet submarine HMS Superb is at Faslane in Scotland and has been there since last Friday. It had been reported that she's been patrolling the blockade zone. Today, the official spokesman pointed out that operational deployment of submarines is never revealed. The only thing that is certain is that the British hunter-killers are off the Falklands and that both sides' forces are now getting closer.
The Foreign Secretary, Mr. Pym, flies to Washington in the morning with the British government's reply to the latest Argentine proposals for a diplomatic settlement. In a statement to MPs this afternoon, he told them about his three-point plan for peace, and he said there'd be no military action while negotiations were still in progress. He answered questions and left. But later he came back, and in a most unusual departure from procedure, he made a second statement. He said he was afraid he might have misled the House when he appeared to rule out the use of force at any specific time.
The whole thrust of my answers throughout the exchanges was to indicate that I was using every endeavor, which indeed I am, to achieve a peaceful settlement, but that, however regrettably, the use of force cannot be ruled out. I understand that in a penultimate answer there might have been some misunderstanding about that I might have used words which have not yet come out of the typewriter upstairs, which might have given a different impression. If so, I would wish to correct it, Mr. Speaker, because I think I did make it clear throughout the exchanges that however hard I was trying to achieve a peaceful settlement, the use of force could not at any stage be ruled out, and if there was any misunderstanding, I want to clear it up.
Well, far from clearing things up, Mr. Pym's most unusual return to the dispatch box has added to the air of mystery. Was it a carefully orchestrated affair, designed to achieve the maximum dramatic effect and thus keep the pressure on the Argentines by reminding them of the threat posed by the task force? Or was it a broad hint that Britain is about to give the flagging diplomatic initiative a push with a display of military muscle? Mr. Pym had told the House in an unscripted answer to a question that he excluded the use of military means while negotiations were in play. There's a long-standing tradition that ministers do not mislead the House, however great the crisis, and when this was taken as a clear indication that the task force would not go into action while the talking continued, Mr. Pym made his re-entry. And that added to much speculation and rumour that Britain is about to turn words into action, perhaps by launching an operation against distant South Georgia Island, poorly defended, out of the effective range of Argentine air support, but if successfully retaken, a blow to Argentine morale and a boost to Britain's. And so there's a new urgency about Mr. Pym's trip tomorrow to Washington, which may, of course, have been the intention. Britain's counter-proposals to those put by the Argentines and rejected by London are being sent on ahead of Mr. Pym so the American Secretary of State, Mr. Haig, can get down to studying them. The proposals were finalised today by Mrs. Thatcher meeting with her in a cabinet. The details are obviously secret, but we do have a broad outline of her thoughts. They're not much changed from her original position, though of course we don't know what's in the small print. There would now appear to be an acceptance in Whitehall that in order to have any hope of achieving a peaceful solution, the British government has to give President Galtieri a ladder to climb down, while at the same time sticking to certain inflexible principles. and so the British government sees the future of the islands as breaking down into 3 phases. First, the complete withdrawal of Argentina's forces. Then would come an interim period of what's described as normality and calm, not too easy after the traumas the islanders have been through, but that would give them an opportunity to reflect on their future, ready for phase 3. That would cover sovereignty and the long-term development of the island. Those bare headings don't appear to have any chance of being acceptable to the Argentines, but of course we don't know the details, and it can be assumed that they do give President Galtieri some room for manoeuvre. On the eve of his Washington mission, Mr. Pym is taking the opportunity tonight of explaining Britain's position to a dinner of diplomats in London, describing the crisis as a test of Britain's ability and will to defend herself. And while he's urging Secretary of State Haig to persuade the Argentines of that, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Dennis Healey, will be on his own peace mission. Mr. Healey is going to New York to talk to the United Nations Secretary-General about Labour's ideas for UN involvement as a mediator if Mr. Haig fails. Well, that UN involvement is a backup possibility in the mind of Mr. Pym as well. But hanging ominously over all the talking is that brief and unexpected interjection he made in the House this afternoon.
Mr. Pym arrives in Washington before Mr. Healey, and he'll be discussing Britain's proposals to settle the dispute in detail with Mr. Haig, and probably with President Reagan as well. Martin Bell looks at the prospects for success in Mr. Pym's mission.
Mr. Pym is apparently coming here at an unpropitious moment. The Hague peace mission has stalled. The Argentinians are refusing to talk sovereignty, yet the United States is still persisting in its policy of even-handedness, as echoed again by the President only yesterday.
Whose side would we be on, sir? I mean, if worst comes to worst, do we have to take sides, or can we stay out of it?
No answer to that question now. That would be a terrible thing to say in the midst of all of the delicate negotiations that are...
But in Congress and in the public at large, Mr. Pym will find a growing sympathy for Britain's cause. There are a number of prominent politicians, like Senator John Tower of Texas, who are not at all even-handed.
I believe the British acted and are acting absolutely properly. I deplore this act of naked aggression against people who are accustomed to democratic institutions. I think it's an offense to people everywhere who aspire to self-determination or who value self-determination. And I hope ultimately the British prevail.
When Mr. Pym gets here, he'll find a considerable tide of support running in Britain's favour. And if he cares to make a public campaign of it, he'll find a lot of sympathy out there in the country.
In Argentina tonight, President Galtieri's junta continue to assert its hard-line policy on the issue of sovereignty of the Falkland Islands. The latest developments have increased the mood of pessimism in Buenos Aires, as Christopher Morris reports.
There are now serious doubts about whether a peaceful solution to the crisis is still possible. Mrs. Thatcher's unfavourable reaction to Argentina's proposals to end the conflict has been followed by the military junta reaffirming its hardline policy. And in what seems to be a major setback, the Argentine foreign minister has emphatically denied there was any discussion of sovereignty over the Falklands during the 3 days of talks with Mr. Haig.
For us, the real thing, the big thing, the thing we cannot and we won't move from that is sovereignty on the islands belong to Argentina.
Baffling statement this, since sovereignty remains the critical issue. Now, Senor Costa Mendes will be flying to Washington this weekend after Mr. Pym has presented Britain's counter-proposals. On the Falkland Islands, banks, businesses and schools are now closed by order of the military governor. And in further moves to isolate the British community, telephones have been cut off and mail deliveries banned. The army has installed its own phone system. Letters are held in the island's capital, and the walk to collect them means an escort of soldiers with guns. A third of Port Stanley's population of 1,000 has now fled into the countryside. And as fears mount of a British attack to seize back the Falklands, many of the town's children have been smuggled out to the relative safety of remote farming settlements. Soldiers now stand guard outside houses they've taken over, while others are busy in the back gardens digging holes for machine gun positions. The soldiers clearly intend to be here for a long time. They've been issued with special combat clothing for the cold winter ahead. Morale among the Argentine troops is high. They say they'll defend the islands against so-called British aggression and fight to the death. At Port Stanley's airport, howitzers aim skywards in the likely direction from which a British air raid could come. For the moment, the gun barrels remain covered. The fishing harbour is defended too. Among the Argentine vessels, one of the gunboats which broke through Britain's naval blockade without being sunk. All the time overhead, Air Force transport planes bring in more arms, ammunition and supplies. For the islanders, it's a bewildering, frightening time. This is the reality of their new life in the Falkland Islands under Argentina's Army of Occupation.
Another 30 people, many children among them, left the Falkland Islands today to return to Britain. They left of their own accord. They each had stories to tell of the Argentine invaders. Clive Ferguson caught up with them when they arrived in Uruguay on the first stage of their journey back.
This party of 30 had left voluntarily but reluctantly. They hadn't been treated badly by the Argentines, but each had his or her own reason for leaving, most of them stemming from the increasing tension on the islands.
Because I've got a baby and it's safer at home.
You had no problems? There were no other more serious problems than that for you out there, were there?
It was very frightening and the place was getting very tense. Although there's no water now, or very little water, they're having difficulty in getting enough water supplies and it's rationed. But apart from that, no, they were not harmed.
You're looking forward to getting back home?
Yeah.
But what was it like when you were out there? Did you have any problems with the Argentine soldiers?
No, they were all right. They just followed us around. They didn't follow us around. They just waved to us and tried to be friendly.
They're fairly friendly. None have left for good, though. They may have had to pay dearly to leave, £850 each, but they all want to go back to the British Falklands, not the Argentine Malvinas, and to schools which teach their children English, not Spanish, which was the Argentine plan after next term. But when and if that proves possible is a matter for conjecture. Although these people were once at the centre of the Falklands crisis, now their immediate future lies outside their control.
Two of the civilian ships pressed into service to support the task force have now moved beyond Ascension Island. One of them is the 45,000-ton cruise liner Canberra, converted into a troop-carrying ship. She's now been internally refitted and is being rehearsed for her possible role as a hospital ship. Jeremy Hands has been watching the preparations.
The grim reality of why Canberra is sailing south was never brought home to the 2,000 men aboard more clearly than when they saw the hospital facilities being prepared. 20 tons of medical stores are in this ship and being busily unpacked and made ready. Bandages for flesh wounds, equipment for the surgeons and the operating theatres are all being prepared. And as stretchers are converted into 4 operating tables, carpenters work on preparing the wards. The conversion of the cruise liner games room into an operating theatre is underway in the most cramped conditions, with the below-deck strengthening of one of the impromptu helicopter flight decks, making that conversion even harder. The cabaret lounge is being turned into an aftercare ward with 50 beds lying on the carpets, where not so long ago passengers were applauding top singers and comedians. And while the work continues to transform part of the ship into what is being quaintly termed an emergency medical facility, at least one of the medical officers aboard has set himself the extra task of learning Spanish, as he said, just in case.
The European Parliament meeting in Strasbourg has overwhelmingly supported Britain in her dispute over the Falklands and condemned Argentina's action. Although some socialists wanted the British task force to be turned back, the Parliament was united in its determination to continue sanctions against Argentina. From Strasbourg, Kate Adey reports.
It's not often that the Euro Parliament can wallow happily in the knowledge that the common market has not only agreed about something, but taken action, a swift and unanimous trade embargo against Argentina. Today they achieved wholesale condemnation of the Argentine invasion, but with the socialist group dissenting about British military force. However, there was no doubting the strength of the condemnation by the whole Parliament of the Argentine invasion, and the need for a long-term settlement which takes into account British sovereignty and the wishes of the islanders was stressed in particular by the British Conservatives.
We believe and hope that this solution is not beyond the wit of man, although it may indeed prove to be beyond the dictatorial bunch which seizes other people's territory by force and rules its own people by terror. We need agreement. But it is inconceivable to this House, where it is almost impossible to move without falling over human rights, that the islanders, let alone the islands, should be in any way subjected to the attentions of a regime the kind of regime which pulls out your fingernails.
Sentiments endorsed by right and left-wing alike, but the socialists, led by Barbara Castle in pugnacious mood, insisted on tabling a motion calling for a simultaneous withdrawal of Argentine forces and the British fleet. Too much for the right wing of the Parliament to swallow, and Mrs. Castle had to shout her way through her speech.
A selective morality. We stand united behind our comprehensive one.
But at the end of the day, there's overwhelming support for Britain and for action against Argentina from the 10 EEC countries until a peaceful diplomatic solution is reached.
The embargo on arms sales to Argentina could cost more than 200 people their jobs at a munitions firm in Lincolnshire. The company, British Manufacture and Research, has had its export licenses for Argentina revoked. And now the rest of the news. In the Middle East, Israeli planes have launched a major bombing raid across the border with Lebanon. It's the first time they've done this since the beginning of the current ceasefire last July. The Israelis began by attacking targets near Damour. Then they went further north and bombed the outskirts of Beirut. The Israelis say they shot down 2 Syrian MiG fighters which tried to intercept them. They described the attack as a retaliation for recent violations of the ceasefire by Palestinians. And they say the targets were all guerrilla camps. The Lebanese say 60 Israeli planes were involved in the attack. There are reports that 14 people were killed and dozens injured. Lebanon has sent an urgent complaint to the UN Security Council, and Britain too has deplored the raid. The attack began a few hours after Mr. Begin and his cabinet gave their final approval for the handover of the rest of Sinai to Egypt on Sunday, in accordance with the Camp David peace treaty. Almost immediately, Israeli soldiers moved into the town of Yamit, where Jewish extremists have been resisting the handover. Our Middle East correspondent Graham Leach watched the extremists being evicted.
Israeli sold one. Most of the protesters put up only passive resistance to their eviction. A few who threatened to commit suicide were tonight reported to have changed their minds. Clearly, the army faces a race against time to clear the town by Sunday's deadline. They hope most protesters, encouraged by their religious leaders, will eventually decide to go quietly.
Recent violence in Northern Ireland and the series of car bombs which culminated in 2 deaths early today have been described by Cardinal Tommaso Fee as a sad Easter litany. Noel McCulloch and Wilbert Kennedy, both in their 30s, died when a car bomb exploded in Magherafelt, County Londonderry. 3 other people were injured in what was the 6th car bomb explosion in the province in 8 hours. Brian Barron reports.
The police had only 10 minutes to clear Magherafelt before the IRA bomb exploded. It was in a stolen car left 100 yards from the police station, which today flew its flag at half-mast. Noel McCulloch, who died with his friend, had just returned from a Bahamas rugby tour. A town councillor, who's a leader of Ian Paisley's third force, says there was a show of IRA bravado.
The IRA were out to kill. They have no thought of life or property. Indeed, last night when they were leaving this town, they were so cock-a-hoop about what they were doing and what they had done, they fired shots into the air as they were leaving.
The police think the IRA are out to raise tension before next month's first anniversary of hunger striker Bobby Sands' death. And here in Belfast, the court's been told about sensitive documents found in a police raid on the main Protestant paramilitary group, the UDA. 6 men, including the UDA leader, Andy Tirry, face charges of conspiring to possess documents useful to terrorists and conspiring to possess arms and ammunition. A police witness said a well-organized filing system was found at UDA headquarters, giving details of judges, magistrates, prosecutors and policemen. And there are also particulars of IRA suspects and Republican officials. The 6 UDA men have been remanded in custody until Friday.
Maureen Long, the Bradford woman who survived an attack by the Yorkshire Ripper, has been awarded £8,500 damages by the High Court in London. In the attack, Mrs. Long suffered stab wounds, broken ribs and a fractured skull. But she also received compensation for the psychological damage. Mrs. Long said her personality had changed. and she had recurrent nightmares and feared being out alone. It seems that rush hour driving goes more smoothly with no police or traffic wardens around. At least that's been the case in the Bristol area for the past year. As an experiment, traffic police have been withdrawn during rush hours, and it's proved such a success that it's now to be made permanent. John Norman reports.
Up to a year ago, Bristol rush hour traffic was very definitely something to be avoided. To those who had no choice, it certainly seemed that the helping hand of the police and traffic warden was the only way to get to work. Then Avon County Council and the police agreed to what seemed an audacious idea. Take the point duty people off and leave the drivers to a free-for-all. The commuters found it hard to believe. Traffic began to flow more smoothly, and the usual bottlenecks disappeared as drivers cooperated. At 31 key sites, traffic flows improved, much to police satisfaction and some surprise.
What happens is that the motorist, when left to his own devices, will react quicker than when he's waiting for direction. And there have been certain measures introduced which allow traffic to travel faster as well.
More police have been released for other duties, and there are fewer accidents. The Bristol rush hour free-for-all is here to stay.
A request sent straight to the Queen, and 7-year-old Deborah Spiller had her dreams answered. A day with the household cavalry. Thanks to Debbie's bold approach, she was given a personal tour and shown a typical day in the life of a royal horse. The crowning moment was a ride on Octave, the horse Lord Mountbatten used to ride on state occasions. The man who's become the public face of astronomy to millions, Patrick Moore, has celebrated the 25th anniversary of his programme The Sky at Night. The first edition was broadcast 6 months before the space age began with Sputnik 1. But as Gary Lloyd reports, The Sky at Night and its own star look to be with us for a long time to come.
He still calls himself an amateur astronomer, and when Patrick Moore was chosen by chance to present The Sky at Night, no one expected the programme to last longer than 3 months. But he endeared himself to expert and ignoramus alike, a style with the common touch.
First of all, here's a globe to represent Uranus, and here's a globe to represent the Earth on the same scale. And you can see there's a very considerable difference. Uranus is nearly 30,000 miles across, and you could throw 50 Earths inside it and still leave a certain amount of room to spare.
There's some pretty awful things happen to you on the Earth, isn't there?
Yes, the famous episode when I swallowed a large fly doing an actual transmission. I gave a gulp and it went down. My mother had the answer. She said, yes, dear, it was nasty for you, but so much worse for the fly.
You're a very difficult chap.
BBC Television's managing director, Aubrey Singer, commended Patrick Moore as a communicator of science. The binoculars replace a pair dropped and broken in his own observatory.
That is terrific.
And after 25 years of interplanetary fast talk, it's said that Patrick hasn't run out of words or space. There's more to come.
Look your last on this wonderful work of art.
In tonight's European football matches, Aston Villa went through to the final of the European Cup after a goalless draw against Anderlecht in the second leg in Belgium. Villa had a 1-0 advantage from the first leg. Tonight's match was stopped for 6 minutes through crowd trouble. In the Cup Winners' Cup semi-final in Spain, the latest score we have is Barcelona 1, Spurs 0. The first leg ended in a 1-1 draw. And the headlines tonight: the task force has made its first contact with the Argentine military. A spy plane approached the carrier Hermes and was chased off by 2 Harrier jets. The Foreign Secretary, Mr. Pym, goes to Washington tomorrow with his peace plan. Today he warned that there could be fighting, even while the talking continued. And as he prepared to leave, the Argentine junta said again, we won't budge on the sovereignty of the islands. And that's all from us for tonight. Good night.
If you're following BBC Two's new serialisation of Wilkie Collins' classic story The Woman in White, you may like to know that Part 2 has just started. And now on 1, the weather outlook from Michael Fish.
Good evening to you. It's still a recipe for fine, settled weather. Indeed, it looks as if high pressure is going to be with us for as far ahead as we can tell. So that's many more days. There are other ingredients, though. We have this cold front working its way down from the northwest, but it's a very weak affair indeed. In fact, if we look again at the satellite picture, you can see that the There is a band of cloud just working its way down towards northwestern parts, but there isn't much to it, except that every now and again there's just a little hump of thicker cloud that may bring rather more in the way of rain. But for much of the country, as you can see, it's clear skies all the way. And that means, as far as tonight's concerned, that for most places, with those clearing skies, it'll be rather a chilly night again, a touch of ground frost around, some fog patches as well. Over Scotland and Northern Ireland, though, rather more in the way of cloud. Even there, though, there'll be a few breaks, but the cloud, I think, thick enough, especially in northwestern parts, to give you a spot or two of rain. And then tomorrow, well, any fog around in England and Wales, it isn't going to last long. It'll clear away during the morning, and for most places, it'll settle into a dry day and a warm one, although coastal areas will be rather on the cool side again. Northernmost parts, though, probably, as the day goes on, will become increasingly cloudy. Over Scotland and Northern Ireland, a good deal of cloud around to begin with, the odd bright interval, but equally the cloud thick enough, especially in northwestern parts, to give 1 or 2 spots of rain, although later in the day it will become somewhat brighter.
Sally Ann Triplett and Stephen Fisher, alias Bardo, fly the flag for Britain on Saturday in the Eurovision Song Contest. 18 countries will be in search of a winning song, and Radio Times goes behind the technical scenes of this annual event to explore the complex mass communications network that will broadcast the contest live from Britain and into the homes of 300 million people throughout Europe. And from the newest rising stars to a silver supernova, Patrick Moore, celebrating 25 years of the sky at night on Sunday with a special edition featuring some of the milestones of astronomy over the last quarter century. The discovery of pulsars and the building of giant computerized radio telescopes. And the dawn of the space age, with probes now approaching the very edge of the known universe. All this and Patrick Moore feature in the new edition of Radio Times.
Here on BBC1 now, we have the last of 3 investigations into rough justice and the case of Little Boy Blue.
John Walters is locked up in Broadmoor Mental Hospital. His crime, sexual assault. Walters was convicted in 1973 for indecently assaulting a young girl in a railway carriage. 3 railwomen saw the attacker. All of them, and the girl herself, described him as 5'7" to 5'9", slimly built, and wearing blue denim clothes. Walters is 6 foot tall. At the time, he weighed 14.5 stone, and he didn't own any blue denim clothes. Yet now, 8.5 years later, Walters is here in Broadmoor Hospital. And those who believe in his innocence say the only reason he's detained is that he won't confess his guilt. British Rail's southern region is one of the busiest commuter networks in the world.